She dropped the vial into his wedding goblet with steady hands and not a single tear. No hesitation, no prayer, just silence, and the soft clink of silver against silver. Every noble in that grand hall was laughing, raising their glasses, celebrating the union of the most feared duke in all of Greyhollow and the quiet daughter of a ruined house. They toasted to a future they knew nothing about. They cheered for a bride they had already forgotten the name of. But she remembered everything. She remembered the night her father knelt on cold stone and begged the Duke for mercy. She remembered the letter that came back, sealed with the Greyhollow crest, carrying not mercy but ruin. She remembered her younger brother's face when they told him they had nothing left, no land, no title, no name worth speaking. And now here she stood, dressed as a duchess, at the head of the most powerful table in the kingdom, pouring quiet revenge into a goblet of fine wine. The Duke lifted his glass. The hall fell into a reverent hush. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something strange passed across his iron face. Not suspicion, not cruelty, something that looked almost like recognition, like he had been waiting for her, and that one look cracked something open in her chest that she was not prepared for, because you do not poison a man who looks at you like that. Or do you? Now here is what I need to know from you. If you were in her place, would you have stopped, or would you have let him drink? Tell me in the comments, and tell me what beautiful part of the world you are watching from. Your location in the comments means more than you know. And if this story already has your heart, please subscribe. There is so much more coming. The morning of her wedding, Lettice Dawnmore did not pray. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed in the east wing of Greyhollow Manor, the one they had given her like a charitable afterthought, and she stared at the small glass vial resting in the centre of her pale palm. It was no larger than her thumb. The liquid inside it was colourless, almost beautiful, the way dangerous things often are. Old Sura had pressed it into her hand 3 nights before, in the dark corridor behind the kitchens, whispering with a mouth full of missing teeth and eyes full of something ancient. 1 drop, Sura had said, just 1, into anything he drinks. It will not kill him, child. It will only make him weak enough for the truth to surface. Lettice had not asked what truth. She already knew. She curled her fingers around the vial and stood. The room around her was bare, in the way that said she had never truly been welcomed here. No flowers on the windowsill, no warm fire in the hearth. Just cold stone walls and the sound of distant preparations, carriages arriving, servants calling to one another across the courtyard, a house waking up for a wedding that nobody had truly wanted. Nobody except the Duke himself, and that, more than anything, was what unsettled her. Duke Castian Vrell of Greyhollow had not been forced into this arrangement. He had chosen it. He had sent the contract to her father's solicitor with his own hand, sealed it with his own ring, and set the date himself. No negotiation, no courtship, no letter of introduction or polite preliminary visit, just a summons dressed up as a proposal. Her father, Lord Dawnmore, had wept when he read it. Not from joy, from relief. The kind of relief that breaks a man open because he has been holding his breath for so long that he had forgotten what air felt like. The Duke had been the one to ruin them 3 years prior. A single letter, dispatched from Greyhollow, had stripped the Dawnmore family of their eastern holdings, their trade licenses, and finally their reputation. It had been swift, methodical, and utterly without feeling, like cutting grass. Nobody in society had questioned it. Nobody ever questioned the Duke of Greyhollow. And then, without explanation, without apology, he had turned around and asked for Lettice's hand. Her younger brother Pell had raged about it for 2 full days. Pell was 17, and furious in the way only the young and powerless can be. He had thrown a chair. He had shouted things that would have earned him a duel if anyone with rank had been listening. And then he had gone very quiet, which was worse. It was Pell's silence that had pushed Lettice toward old Sura. It was Pell's silence that had made her take the vial. She tucked it into the hidden pocket, sewn into the seam of her wedding gown, the one her mother's old seamstress Bryn had stitched without asking why. Bryn was 60 years old and had survived 2 wars and 3 difficult marriages. She asked very few questions. Lettice looked at herself once in the cracked mirror near the door. She did not look like a woman in love. She looked like a woman who had made a decision. That was enough. The wedding ceremony took place in the great hall of Greyhollow Manor, beneath a ceiling so high it swallowed sound before it could echo. The hall had been dressed with white roses and trailing greenery, which Lettice found almost offensive in its loveliness. Beauty had no business decorating a transaction. 300 guests had come, lords and ladies from across the county, minor nobility from the northern reaches, merchants with new money and old ambitions. They filled the pews in their finest clothes and watched her walk the length of that cold stone floor alone, because her father's knees had given out that morning from the anxiety, and he was seated near the front with a pale, tight face and trembling hands. Pell stood beside him, jaw set, eyes fixed on the floor. He did not look up when she passed. That hurt more than she expected. The Duke stood at the far end of the hall, waiting. Lettice had seen him only twice before this day. Once at a county assembly 3 years ago, before the ruin, when he had stood at the edge of the room like a man attending his own sentencing. And once, more recently, through the window of his carriage as it rolled past the Dawnmore townhouse, slow enough that she had wondered if it was deliberate. He was tall, that she remembered, and still, the kind of stillness that did not come from peace, but from control, from a man who had trained himself so thoroughly that even his silences had edges. Standing at the altar now, he was exactly as she remembered, except for his eyes. His eyes were watching her, not the way men usually watch brides, with that lazy, proprietary satisfaction. He was watching her the way one watches something they are genuinely uncertain about, careful, almost cautious. It made no sense. This was his arrangement, his summons, his hall. Why should he look uncertain in his own kingdom? The ceremony was short. The officiant, a thin man named Rector Hulse, spoke the words with the enthusiasm of someone reading a list of provisions. Vows were exchanged. Rings were placed. The hall applauded with the polished warmth of people who knew how to perform approval without feeling it. And then it was done. She was the Duchess of Greyhollow. The name settled on her shoulders like cold armour. The wedding feast began almost immediately. Long tables had been laid in the adjoining hall, heavy with food and silver, and the kind of excess that reminded everyone present of exactly how much power lived within these walls. Candles burned in rows of 100. Wine flowed without pausing. Lettice sat at the head table beside her husband, a word that still felt foreign and sharp, and watched the room without participating in it. The Duke ate in near silence. He spoke to the guests who approached with the minimum required courtesy. Nothing more, never less. He was not rude. He was precise. There was a difference, though most people in that room were too impressed by his presence to notice it. His steward, a broad-shouldered man named Galt, circulated the room on his behalf, accepting compliments, deflecting inquiries, managing the evening with efficient grace. On Galt's right was a younger man, Piers, the Duke's personal secretary, thin and sharp-eyed, who kept glancing at Lettice in a way she could not quite categorize, not hostile, not friendly, watchful. She filed that away. To her left sat Lady Oran, a stout woman of 60, with tremendous eyebrows and a voice built for pronouncements. Lady Orun had apparently known the Duke's late mother and felt this gave her certain privileges, chief among them the ability to speak without being spoken to. "You are quieter than I expected," Lady Orun announced, leaning toward Lettice with the confidence of someone delivering a compliment. "I am often quiet," Lettice replied. Lady Orun studied her with open curiosity. "He chose well, then. The last thing Greyhollow needs is more noise." Lettice smiled because it was required. Across the table, she caught the gaze of a young woman with copper hair and an uncomfortable expression, seated between two older men who were arguing across her about land taxes. The young woman gave Lettice a brief, sympathetic look, as if to say, "I see you. I know this is not easy." Lettice did not know who she was, but she noted the kindness. The goblets were filled for the first toast near the end of the first hour. Galt raised his voice above the hall and called for silence, and the room obeyed the way rooms always obey in houses built from old money and older authority. Lettice's hand moved to her hidden pocket before she had consciously decided anything. Her fingers found the vial. She looked at the Duke's goblet. It sat just before him, full and waiting. She looked at the Duke. He was not looking at her. He was looking at something across the room, something near the door, and his expression had changed so completely that for a moment she almost did not recognize him. The careful control had slipped, just slightly, and underneath it was something raw, something that looked like grief. She followed his gaze. Near the door stood a man she did not recognize, older, perhaps 60, with white hair and a rigid posture that suggested military history. He was not dressed like a guest. He wore travelling clothes, dusty from the road, and he was staring at the Duke with an expression that matched grief for grief. And then Galt appeared from nowhere, positioned himself between the door and the Duke's sightline, and the moment was over. The old man was gone. The Duke's face was closed again, smooth and controlled as polished stone. But Lettice had seen it, that crack, that unguarded second. She pulled her hand from her pocket. The vial was warm from being held. Galt finished the toast. The hall drank. She lifted her goblet and touched it to her lips, without swallowing. The Duke turned to look at her then, as if sensing her stillness in the noise of the room. "You did not drink," he said. His voice was low, quiet enough that only she could hear it. She met his gaze. "The wine does not agree with me." He looked at her for a long moment, in that careful, uncertain way he had looked at her at the altar. Then he set his own goblet down without drinking either, and said nothing more. The guests did not leave until well past midnight. Lettice endured it all. Every introduction, every whispered compliment about the manor, every sideways glance from women who had expected the Duke to choose someone with a larger inheritance and a less complicated history. She smiled where smiling was required. She answered questions with the precision of someone who had rehearsed politeness so thoroughly it had become a second skin. But underneath all of it, her mind was turning. He had not drunk. She had not given him the vial. She had pulled her hand back at the last moment, disturbed by that crack in his composure, that grief she had not expected, that old man at the door who had been there for one breath and then swallowed by the crowd. She told herself she had simply been waiting for a better moment. But that was not entirely true, and she knew it. The last guests departed in a procession of carriages that rattled away down the long gravel drive, their lanterns swinging in the dark like restless stars. Lettice stood at the top of the manor steps beside the Duke and watched them go. The night air was cold. Neither of them spoke. When the final carriage disappeared around the bend and silence returned to Greyhollow, the Duke turned to his steward. "Galt, see that the household is secured for the night." "Your Grace." Galt bowed and moved away without a glance in Lettice's direction. Piers, The secretary was already inside, gathering papers from somewhere with his usual quiet urgency. Lady Auran had taken herself to the guest quarters an hour before, loudly declaring that celebrations were wasted on people who had no sense of festivity. The copper-haired young woman, Lettice had learnt during supper, was named Tilda, the niece of one of the county lords, and she had left early with a headache and another one of those brief, sincere looks that Lettice could not stop thinking about, which left Lettice and the Duke standing alone at the top of the steps. He did not offer his arm. He did not make any of the polished gestures she had been bracing herself against all evening. He simply turned toward the door and said quietly, "Come, I will show you something." She followed because she did not know what else to do. He led her not toward the grand staircase, not toward the ducal apartments she had been dreading for entirely different reasons, but down a side corridor she had not yet seen, lit by a single line of wall sconces that threw long shadows across old portraits and older stone. He stopped at the end of the corridor, before a door that was smaller than it ought to be for a house this size. He produced a key from inside his coat, unlocked it, and pushed it open. Beyond it was a library. Not the formal library she had been shown on her brief tour of the manor 2 weeks before, with its tall shelves and velvet reading chairs arranged for impression rather than use. This was something entirely different. The room was round, tucked into what must have been a tower base, and every wall was shelves from floor to ceiling, filled with books that had clearly been read. Spines cracked, pages soft with use, margins visible from the doorway, filled with notes in small, close handwriting. In the centre of the room was a single wide table, covered in papers, maps, correspondence, and 2 oil lamps that someone had left burning low. She stepped inside before she realized she had decided to. "This was my mother's room," the Duke said from behind her. She read everything she could find, history mostly. She believed you could not understand the present without understanding what came before it. Lettice turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway, not quite entering, as if the room was still hers and he was still a guest in it. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I want you to understand something about this house before you begin forming conclusions about it." She felt the words land. They were careful words, chosen carefully. He was not a man who spoke carelessly. She had gathered that much already. "What conclusions do you imagine I have already formed?" she asked. He looked at her, that careful, uncertain look again. "That Greyhollow is a place of cruelty, that I am a man without reason, that what happened to your family was without purpose." The air in the room shifted. She kept her voice steady. "Was it? With purpose, I mean." He crossed to the table and lifted one of the papers from the top of the nearest pile. He held it out to her without speaking. She took it. It was a letter, old by the look of the ink. The handwriting was not the Duke's. She could see that immediately it was looser, more urgent, written by someone whose hand had been shaking. She read it, and then she read it again. The letter was addressed to the previous Duke of Greyhollow, Castian's father, and it was signed by a man named Lettice Dawnmore, her grandfather. The letter detailed an arrangement, an old one. A debt paid not in money, but in land, in silence, in the quiet burial of a secret that the writer described only in careful circles, never naming it outright, but circling it with the desperation of someone trying to contain a fire with words alone. Her hands had gone very still. "What is this?" she asked, though part of her already understood the shape of it. "The beginning," the Duke said, "of a much longer story than either of us was told." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression she could not name, the one that was not cruelty and not warmth, but something that lived between the two, something that had been waiting a long time to be seen clearly. "My father destroyed your family," he he said, because your grandfather asked him to. The words did not make sense at first. They sat in the air of the round library and refused to arrange themselves into meaning. That is not possible, she said. Your grandfather made an agreement with my father 30 years ago, the Duke said. An agreement that kept a secret buried. When your grandfather died, your father inherited the debt, but not the knowledge of what the debt was for. He began asking questions he should not have asked, in places he should not have been asking them. My father panicked. He moved to silence the inquiry before it could reach the wrong ears. He paused. He was not a careful man, my father. He was only a powerful one. And you? She asked. Where were you in all of this? Learning, he said, too slowly. By the time I understood what my father had done, he was dead, and the damage was already complete. He turned away from her, toward the nearest shelf, and ran one hand along a row of spines without pulling any of them out. I could not undo the ruin publicly without exposing the secret. And the secret, once exposed, would destroy more than just our two families. So you married me instead, she said flatly. I married you, he said, turning back, because it was the only restitution I had the power to offer without burning everything else to the ground. I married you because your brother deserves his name back, because your father deserves to sleep at night, and because you deserve to know the truth, even if the truth is ugly. The room was very quiet. Somewhere deep in the manor, a clock began to strike the hour. 1, 2. It reached 12 and stopped, and the silence that followed was immense. Lettice looked down at the letter in her hands, at her grandfather's shaking handwriting, at the careful circles of a man hiding something he was ashamed of. She thought about the vial in her pocket. She thought about old Sura, pressing it into her palm with those ancient eyes full of something she had not stopped to question. She thought about Pell, jaw set, eyes on the floor, not watching her walk toward this man. And she thought about the old man at the door of the wedding hall, the one with white hair and a military posture and grief on his face that matched the Duke's grief exactly. Who was the man at the door tonight? She asked. During the toasts, the one in travelling clothes. The Duke went very still, stiller than she had seen him yet. You noticed him, he said. It was not a question. I notice most things, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a decision being made, a door being considered. His name is Barrow, the Duke said at last. He was my father's closest adviser for 30 years. He is also the only living man who knows the full content of the secret your grandfather helped bury. And is he dangerous? She asked. The Duke's answer was immediate and quiet. Extremely. The vial pressed against her palm through the fabric of her pocket, warm and small and waiting. She had come here tonight to poison this man. She had not expected him to hand her something far more dangerous than poison. She had not expected the truth. Lettice did not sleep that night. She lay in the Duchess's chamber, a room 3 times the size of the one she had been given before the ceremony, with a ceiling painted in faded gold and curtains so heavy they swallowed every sound from outside. The bed was wide enough to feel like a field. The fire had been laid and lit by a maid she had not yet learned the name of, and it burned low and steady through the dark hours. She stared at the ceiling and thought about her grandfather. Orvin Dawnmore had died when she was 9 years old. She remembered a man with a broad laugh and ink-stained fingers who brought her ribbons from the market and called her his little magistrate because she always wanted to know the reason behind every rule. She had loved him without question, the way children love people who are entirely kind to them. She had never once considered what he might have been to other people. What had he buried? What was so large, so dangerous, that a dead man's silence had stretched across 30 years and swallowed 2 families whole? She turned onto her side and looked at the vial on the bedside table. She had taken it out of her pocket before getting into bed, meaning to put it somewhere safe, and then found she could not move it further than arm's reach. It sat in the low firelight and caught the glow like a small, patient eye. "One drop," old Sura had said. "It will not kill him. It will only make him weak enough for the truth to surface." But the truth had already surfaced. The Duke had handed it to her himself, freely, in a round library full of his dead mother's books, with no audience and no performance, and nothing to gain from the telling except the telling itself. Which meant either he was the most disarming liar she had ever encountered, or old Sura had known something Lettice did not. She sat up. The fire popped and settled. Old Sura was not simply a kitchen worker with a remedy for every ailment. Everyone below the stairs knew that, even if no one said it plainly. Sura had been at Greyhollow Manor long before any of the current staff. She had arrived, according to the older maids, with the previous Duchess, Castian's mother, brought from her family home as a personal attendant 30 years ago. 30 years, the same length of time as the secret. Lettice was out of bed before she finished the thought. She pulled a robe over her nightgown, took the vial, and slipped out into the corridor. Greyhollow Manor, at 2 a.m, was a different creature entirely. The grand proportions that impressed during daylight became something stranger at night, too large, too full of shadow, the kind of house that seemed to breathe. Wall sconces burned at long intervals, casting pools of amber light with long stretches of dark between them. She took the back stairs, the ones that led down through the servants' passage toward the kitchens. She found Sura exactly where she half expected to find her, awake, seated at the long kitchen table with a clay cup and an expression that suggested she had been waiting. "You did not use it," Sura said. "No," Lettice said. She sat down across from her without being invited. "I want to know what it actually is." Sura looked at her with those ancient, careful eyes. "I told you what it is." "You told me what it does. That is not the same thing." Lettice placed the vial on the table between them. "You have been in this house for 30 years. You came with his mother. You gave me something to put in the Duke's drink on his wedding night, and told me only enough to make me willing." She held the old woman's gaze. "Tell me the rest." Sura was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the kitchen hearth was lower than it should have been, and the room had the specific chill of a space that had been awake all night. Then she said, "The previous Duke did not ruin your family out of panic." Lettice went still. "He ruined your family on instruction," Sura continued, "from a man named Barrow, who convinced the old Duke that your father had discovered not just the secret, but the location of something the secret was meant to protect." "What location?" Lettice asked. "Documents," Sura said. "A record of every arrangement, every payment, every name, attached to what your grandfather helped hide 30 years ago. Barrow has been searching for those documents for years. He believes they are somewhere in this house." She paused. "He was at the wedding tonight." "I saw him," Lettice said. Sura's eyes sharpened. "Then you understand. He was not there to celebrate. He was there to see whether the new Duchess was a threat or a tool." The kitchen was very quiet. "And which am I?" Lettice asked. "That," Sura said, "depends entirely on what you do next." Lettice looked at the vial. "Does Castian know about the documents?" "He knows they exist. He does not know where they are." Sura wrapped both hands around her clay cup. His mother knew. She hid them herself the night before she died, because she did not trust her husband's advisor. She did not trust Barrow. "She was right not to," Lettice said quietly. "She was right about most things," Sura agreed. "She was also the one who arranged the match between you and her son." The words landed like something dropped from a height. Lettice stared at her. "She died 2 years ago." "Yes." She made the arrangement before she died. She left instructions with the solicitor. She chose you specifically, child. Not your name or your rank. You. She had watched your family for years. She knew your grandfather's role. She believed that if the truth ever came out cleanly, it would need someone from your line to bear witness to it. Someone with enough reason to want justice and enough sense not to mistake revenge for the same thing. The fire settled again. A log broke apart in the hearth and sent a brief scatter of sparks up the chimney. Lettice thought about her grandfather's shaking handwriting. She thought about her father's exhausted face on the morning of the wedding. She thought about Pell's silence, which was not the silence of defeat, but of something waiting, something coiled. "The vial," she said. "If not to weaken the Duke, what is it truly for?" Sura looked at her steadily. It was never for the Duke. The cold moved through the kitchen like a third presence. "It was for Barrow," Sura said. "If he came close enough, if he made a move, I gave it to you, because I could not be certain he would not reach you before the Duke had a chance to explain anything. A precaution, child, nothing more." Lettice picked up the vial and closed her fingers around it. Outside, somewhere across the manor grounds, a horse moved in the stables. A single, uneasy sound, hooves shifting on stone, and then silence again. She looked at the door. She thought about Barrow's face at the wedding. Grief on the surface, something harder underneath. "He will come back," she said. "Before the week is out," Sura agreed. Lettice stood. She tucked the vial back into her robe pocket and looked at the old woman across the table. "Why did you not simply tell me all of this from the beginning?" Sura looked up at her with an expression that was almost fond. "Because you needed to walk into that hall tonight as a woman capable of using it," she said. "Not as a woman who had been told a story. There is a difference. Barrow would have seen through the second one before you opened your mouth." Lettice held her gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and went back upstairs. She did not sleep, but she lay still and she thought. And by the time grey morning light began to press through the heavy curtains, she had the beginning of something that resembled a plan. At breakfast, the Duke was already at the table. He was reading, a single sheet of correspondence, held in one hand while the other rested on the table near an untouched cup of tea. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them moved, both recalibrating the strangeness of seeing each other in daylight after everything the previous night had carried. She sat down. A maid appeared and poured her tea without being asked. "Barrow," she said, once the maid had retreated. "He is going to come back." The Duke set down the letter. "Yes? He is looking for documents hidden somewhere in this house." The Duke's expression shifted very slightly. "You spoke to Sura." "She found me first," Lettice said, which was close enough to be true. "She told me your mother hid them. She told me Barrow was behind the original instruction to ruin my family. She told me he was at the wedding last night, not as a guest, but as a man taking measures." Castian was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with that careful expression, but something in it had changed since the library. The uncertainty was still there, but it had rearranged itself into something closer to respect. "My mother trusted Sura completely," he said. "I can see why," Lettice said. He lifted his tea and drank, looking toward the window. The morning outside was grey and still, the kind of English morning that pressed down gently on everything beneath it. "I have been trying to find those documents for 2 years," he said, "since I understood what they contained, since I understood what Barrow was." He set the cup down. "This house has 43 rooms, 11 of which have not been properly opened since my mother's death. I have searched 31 of them." "You have not searched the round library," Lettice said. He turned to look at her. "Because it was hers," she continued, "and you have not been able to make yourself go through it properly. You stand in the doorway." He said nothing, but the silence confirmed it. "Let me look," she said. He studied her for a long moment. Then, quietly, He slid the key across the table toward her. She picked it up. Across the room, the door opened, and Piers entered with a leather folio under one arm and an expression of interrupted urgency. He stopped when he saw Lettice, performed a brief, correct bow, and then looked at the Duke. "Barrow has written," he said. "He requests an audience. This week." The Duke's jaw tightened, just barely. "Tell him Thursday." Piers nodded, but his sharp eyes moved to Lettice one more time before he withdrew. She noted it again. That watchfulness, not hostile, not quite. She was going to need to understand Piers before Thursday arrived. She closed her fingers around the key and drank her tea. The round library was different in daylight. The shadows that had made it feel like a secret the night before pulled back in the morning light, and what remained was something both more ordinary and more intimate. Dust moved slowly in the light from the single narrow window. The books on the shelves had the warmth of things that had been loved before they had been left. Lettice stood in the centre of the room and turned slowly. She was not looking for a hidden panel or a loose stone or any of the dramatic conceits of sensation novels. She was looking for logic, for the reasoning of a woman who had been careful enough to hide something important and intelligent enough to hide it somewhere that felt like itself. The desk first? She went through every drawer with methodical patience, not rifling but reading, working through the layers of a life documented in correspondence, household accounts, pressed botanical samples, and the occasional private note written to no one in particular, the kind of thinking on paper that people do when they trust the page more than any audience. The previous Duchess had been a thorough woman, a worried one. The notes grew shorter and more urgent as they progressed in date, the handwriting contracting as if trying to take up less space, to be less visible. Near the bottom of the third drawer, beneath a stack of household menus from 4 years prior, Lettice found a small, flat key. It was too small for any door in the manor. It was the kind of key made for a box, or a case, or something built into a piece of furniture. She stood and looked at the room again. There were no boxes on the visible shelves, no cases on the table. She moved along the shelves slowly, pressing gently on the spines of books, looking for anything that broke the pattern, anything that was not what it appeared to be. She found it on the fourth shelf from the bottom on the east wall, a row of 12 volumes, uniformly bound, with no titles on their spines. They looked like ledgers. They felt, when she pulled the nearest one out, slightly too heavy for their size. She opened it. It was hollow. The pages had been cut away inside, leaving a neat rectangular cavity, and inside the cavity was a second small key, twin to the one from the drawer. She pulled out the adjacent volume, also hollow, also containing something, this time a folded paper, dense with names and figures and dates that meant nothing to her individually, but together had the unmistakable weight of evidence. She pulled out the third, a letter, sealed with a crest she did not recognize. The fourth, a small leather booklet, its cover worn smooth with handling, filled with entries in the same hand as the private notes in the desk. She carried everything to the table and sat down. She read for 2 hours without stopping. By the time she finished, her tea from breakfast had long gone cold in her memory. The fire in her chest had gone the opposite direction, and she understood, finally and completely, what her grandfather had helped bury. 30 years ago, a child had been born outside of marriage to a family of significant rank. Not a minor indiscretion, but a child with a legitimate claim to an inheritance that would have restructured the political landscape of 3 counties. Her grandfather, Orvin Dawnmore, had been the attending solicitor. He had processed the paperwork. He had been offered a substantial sum to reclassify the birth records and have the child's existence quietly erased from the official register. He had taken the money. The child had been Barrow's son. which meant that Barrow for 30 years had not simply been protecting a secret. He had been searching for proof that his son existed, proof that had been taken from him by a transaction her grandfather had facilitated and the previous duke had funded. He was not a villain looking for leverage. He was a father looking for his child. The complexity of it hit her like cold water. She sat with it for a long moment, pressing both palms flat on the surface of the table, breathing evenly. Then she picked up the small leather booklet again and turned to the last entry. The previous Duchess had written it 6 days before her death, in handwriting that was tired but still precise. I have kept these because destroying them would be the same crime twice. The boy deserves to know he existed. Barrow deserves the proof of his son's life, even if the life was short. I could not give him this while my husband lived. I could not bear what it would cost Castian, but I cannot take it with me either. Someone must decide what justice looks like here. I hope she is brave enough for it. The previous Duchess had written she. Lettice set the booklet down very carefully. She looked at the key from the drawer. She looked at the twin key from the hollow book. She had not yet found what they opened. She was still looking at them when the door opened. She had not heard footsteps. That was the first thing that alarmed her. The second was that it was not the Duke. It was Piers. He stepped into the room with the careful, unhurried movement of someone who had expected to find her here, and he closed the door behind him without haste. His sharp eyes moved to the papers on the table, and then back to her face, and she could see him cataloguing everything he needed to know in a single sweep. "You found them," he said. She did not move. "How did you know to come here?" "I did not know," he said. "I hoped." He looked at the table again. "How much have you read?" She studied him. The watchfulness she had been cataloguing since the wedding had a shape now. It was not the watchfulness of an employee tracking his employer's new wife. It was something older than that. Something personal. "Enough," she said. "Who are you, Piers? Truly." He was quiet for a moment. He crossed to the window and looked out at the grey morning, at the grounds of Greyhollow spread below in their winter stillness. When he turned back, something in his face had shifted. The secretary's careful blankness was still there, but underneath it, for the first time, she saw something raw. "My mother was a lady's maid," he said. "She served a family in the northern counties for 12 years. She was dismissed without reference when I was born." He paused. "I spent 15 years trying to understand why. Why a woman who had given 12 years of honest work was turned out with nothing, with a child, in the middle of winter, because of something that was not her fault and was not mine." The room was absolutely still. "The name in those records," Lettice said slowly. "The child whose existence was erased. It is not Barrow's son." Something moved through Piers's expression. "No," he said quietly. "It is not." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "You are the child," she said. He did not confirm it with words, but he did not deny it. And the way he stood, the particular quality of his stillness, suddenly reminded her of someone she had already learned to read. It reminded her of the Duke, not because they were alike in manner, but because they both carried the same particular weight, the weight of someone who had been shaped by a truth they had not been allowed to own. "Does Castian know?" she asked. "No," Piers said. "I came into his employ because I needed access to this house. I needed to find what was hidden here. I was not certain what I would do once I found it." He looked at the papers. "I still am not certain." Outside, on the gravel drive below the window, she heard the sound of a carriage arriving. She moved to the window and looked down. The carriage was plain, no crest on the door. The horses were dark and well kept, the kind that covered distance efficiently rather than impressively. A man climbed out, white-haired, rigid posture, eyes already lifted toward the upper windows of the manor as if he had known exactly where to look. "Barrow," He was not supposed to come until Thursday. She turned from the window and looked at Piers, who had also seen, whose face had gone the complicated colour of someone confronting something they had rehearsed and nothing like imagined. She picked up the documents from the table, all of them. The papers, the letters, the booklet, both keys. She held them against her chest. "Go and find the Duke," she said. "Now, tell him Barrow is here. Tell him to come to this room." Piers looked at her. "And if he asks what is in this room, tell him the truth is," she said. "All of it." Piers held her gaze for one more second. Then he moved. Barrow did not wait to be received. By the time Lettice heard boots on the corridor stone outside the round library, she had already arranged the documents on the table in the order she intended to present them. The leather booklet at the centre, the hollow books stacked to the left, the letters open, waited at their corners with whatever came to hand. She stood behind the table and waited. The door opened, and it was not Piers. It was Barrow himself, and behind him, with the tight expression of a man who had just been walked past in his own house, was Galt. Galt, who was broad and capable and had clearly tried to redirect the older man and failed. Barrow stopped when he saw her. He had expected the room to be empty. She could see that immediately. Whatever intelligence he had gathered about the morning's movements inside Greyhollow had not included her. Good. He was taller than he had appeared from a distance. The military posture she had noted at the wedding was not affectation but structure, the kind that came from decades of holding oneself rigid against circumstances that wanted to bend you. His face was weathered and controlled, but his eyes went straight to the documents on the table, and in that single involuntary movement she saw everything she needed to know about why he was here. Not power, not leverage. Desperation wearing the mask of authority. "You are in the wrong room," she said calmly. "I have business with the Duke," Barrow said. His voice was deep, measured, accustomed to being the most important sound in whatever space it occupied. "The Duke has been informed of your arrival," she said. "He will be here shortly. In the meantime, you will sit down." He looked at her with an expression that was almost amused. Almost. "You are very composed for a woman who has been a duchess for less than 24 hours. And you are very bold for a man who has been lying for 30 years, she replied. The almost amusement left his face. Galt, standing just inside the doorway, said nothing, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly toward alertness. Barrow's eyes moved to the table again, to the documents. She watched him catalogue what was visible, watched the recognition move through him as he identified papers he had spent years searching for. "Where did you find those?" he asked. "Where the previous Duchess hid them," Lettice said. "In plain sight, inside books that looked like ledgers on a shelf that no one had properly searched, because grief makes people careful around the things belonging to the dead." He crossed the room before she had finished the sentence. She did not step back. She pressed her hands flat on the table and held her ground, and he stopped on the other side of it, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into things he was not supposed to look at directly. He looked down at the leather booklet. Something moved through him, not calculation, not aggression. It was grief, the same kind she had seen at the wedding, exposed fully now, without the crowd to thin it. "You know what this is," he said. It was not a question. "I know what all of it is," she said. He looked up at her. For the first time since entering the room, he looked at her rather than through her. "Then you know why I am here." "I know why you have always been here," she said quietly. "I know your son's name was removed from the register before he was old enough to understand what a name was for. I know my grandfather took money to make that happen. I know the previous Duke funded it because the alternative complicated his political arrangements in 3 counties. She held his gaze. "I know you have been searching for proof Not because you want power over anyone in this house, but because you want the only record of your son's existence that was ever put to paper." The room was very still. His hands, resting on the edge of the table, were not entirely steady. "He died at 4 years old," Barrow said. His voice had changed. The authority was still in it, but it had thinned, becoming something else underneath. "His mother died the following winter. I had nothing. Not even the right to mark his grave with his true name, because officially he had never existed." The fire in the corner of the room burned quietly. Lettice thought about her grandfather's shaking handwriting, about a man she had loved without question, who had done a thing she could not undo, for money she had never known existed, to a child who had never had the chance to become anything. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it the way that apologies mean something when they are not defences in disguise. "What was done to your son was wrong. My grandfather's part in it was wrong. Nothing that happens in this room today will change that." Barrow looked at her for a long moment. Then the door opened and Castian came in. He took in the room in a single look. Barrow at the table, Lettice across from him, the documents laid out in deliberate order. He came to stand beside Lettice without speaking, and she felt him read the atmosphere with the precision of a man who had been trained by difficult rooms. He looked at Barrow. "You came early," he said. "I have been patient long enough," Barrow said. The authority had returned to his voice, but it sat differently now, worn rather than wielded. "The documents are here," Castian said. He looked at Lettice briefly, and she gave the smallest nod. "My wife found them this morning." Barrow's eyes moved to her again. Something shifted in them. "Your wife," he repeated slowly, as if recalibrating. "I intend to make this right," Castian said. "As much as it can be made right. The record of your son's birth will be reinstated through the county solicitor. His name will be on paper where it should have been from the beginning. My father's funding of the concealment will be acknowledged in a private legal document that protects no one and excuses nothing." He paused. "That is what I can do. It will not be enough, but it is honest." Barrow stood very straight. The silence stretched long enough to become a different kind of thing. "Why?" Barrow asked at last. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Castian was quiet for a moment. "Because my mother asked me to," he said. "And because it is right. And because continuing to protect a lie that only ever served my father's convenience is not something I am willing to do." Barrow looked at the leather booklet on the table. "May I?" he said. Not demanding, asking. Lettice pushed it gently toward him. He picked it up with both hands, carefully, the way people handle things that have been looked for long enough to become more than objects. He did not open it, he simply held it. And in the round library that had belonged to a woman who had seen all of this coming and tried, in the only way available to her, to prepare for it, the morning moved around them like something that had been held back and was finally allowed to continue. Then the sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor broke it apart. Piers appeared in the doorway, breathing faster than was usual for him, his composure fractured at the edges. He looked at Barrow. Barrow looked at him, and something passed between them that Lettice had not anticipated. Something that was not the recognition of strangers, but the recognition of people who had been circling the same absence for years without knowing the other was circling it too. She watched Barrow's face, watched him look at Piers the way one looks at something that does not make sense, and then, slowly, horribly, begins to. "Who are you?" Barrow asked. His voice had gone very quiet. Piers stood in the doorway and said nothing for a moment that lasted far too long. Then, "My mother's name was Hetta. She served the Greyhollow family in the northern counties for 12 years. She was dismissed in the winter of 1843. The leather booklet in Barrow's hands shook slightly. Not from age, not from the cold. Lettice looked at Castian. He was watching Piers with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the careful control, not the uncertain searching look, but something open and unprepared, and entirely human. She thought about what it meant to be in a room where a truth this old was finally, after 30 years, meeting the people it had always belonged to. She took a quiet step back. Some moments required witness, not management. The county solicitor arrived at Greyhollow on Friday morning. Castian had sent for him the evening before, by express rider, with a letter whose contents he had written himself and shown to Lettice before sealing it. She had read it and said it was good and meant it. The solicitor was a small man named Mr. Fetch, precise and unreadable in the way of men who had spent their careers holding other people's secrets without comment. He came with 2 clerks and a leather case, and he sat in the formal study for 4 hours while documents were reviewed, statements were recorded, and the county register was formally amended to include the name of a boy who had lived for 4 years and deserved, at minimum, to have existed on paper. Barrow sat across from Mr. Fetch for the entirety of it. He did not speak much. He did not need to. He watched the pen move across the record with the stillness of a man who had stopped believing something could happen and was now watching it happen anyway, carefully, as if it might reverse itself if he moved too quickly. Piers sat beside him. They had talked through the night. Lettice did not know the content of the conversation, only that it had happened because she had passed the small sitting room at the end of the east corridor at 3 a.m. on her way back from the kitchen and seen light under the door and heard, not words, but the specific quality of silence that falls between 2 people who have been speaking for a very long time and have finally reached the place where words are no longer the most important thing. She had not stopped. She had gone back to bed. In the morning, Piers had come to breakfast with eyes that were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and something that sat differently in his face, something that had not been there before, a kind of anchor. Barrow had come to breakfast too. The table had been unusual. The Duke at the head, Lettice to his right, Barrow and Piers across from each other, Galt at the far end, nursing his tea, with the expression of a man revising everything he thought he knew about the household he ran. Lady Orun, who had extended her stay without being invited, had sailed in midway through the meal, taken one look at the assembled company, and announced that something interesting had clearly happened overnight, before sitting down and helping herself to everything within reach. Tilda, who had returned that morning with a note of apology for her early departure, and an offering of preserved plums from her uncle's estate, had been absorbed into the breakfast table by Lady Orun before anyone could redirect her, and was now seated beside Galt, looking simultaneously overwhelmed and fascinated. It was the strangest and most human morning Greyhollow Manor had seen in years. Lettice had watched it all and felt something she had not expected to feel in this house. Something close to warmth. After Mr. Fetch and his clerks departed, Castian found her in the garden. She was walking the gravel path along the south wall, the one with the dormant rose beds on either side that would be extraordinary in spring, and were quietly structural now, all bare cane and careful form. She heard his footsteps on the gravel and did not turn, and he fell into step beside her without preamble. They walked in silence for a while. The sky was pale and flat, the kind of winter sky that was not unpleasant but made no promises. The grounds of Greyhollow stretched away from the path in all directions, frost still on the shadowed grass, a crow moving along the far wall with purposeful indifference. "I owe you an honest account," Castian said, "of everything my father did. Not the version I gave you in the library, which was true but incomplete. The full account." "I read the full account," Lettice said, In your mother's notes." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you know he was not a good man." "I know he was a powerful man who made choices that convenient men make," she said. "I know your mother spent years trying to hold the consequences still enough that they did not destroy everything. I know she picked me to finish what she could not." He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. The winter light was not flattering to anyone, but it was honest, and in it he looked like what he was. A man who had inherited a house full of other people's damage and had spent 2 years trying to find a way to repair it that did not require burning it down first. "She chose well," he said quietly. Lettice held his gaze. "Tell me about your father's political arrangements, the ones the concealment protected. Are there people still living who benefited from it beyond Barrow's knowledge?" His jaw tightened slightly. 2. A lord in the western counties who received preferential land grants, and a member of the county assembly who had his debts cleared through the same fund that paid your grandfather. "Then it is not finished," she said. "No," he said, "it is not." She looked out across the frost-covered grounds. "Pell is 17. He wants to study law. Before the ruin, he had a place arranged at the Inns of Court." She paused. "I want it restored, not as charity, as restitution, formal, documented, with the source of the original ruin acknowledged in writing." Castian said nothing for a moment. Then, "Done. My father's Eastern holdings," she continued. "The trade licenses. Not all of them. The arrangement has changed, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But the principle of the loss acknowledged and offset." "Done," he said again. She turned back to look at him. "And Sura. She is to have a formal position in this household, with title and wage, not a kitchen corner and collective blindness about what she actually is." Something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighbourhood. "Done," he said. "Anything else?" She considered. "Yes. Show me the rest of the rooms you have not searched. Not because I think there is more hidden in them, because a house this size, with 43 rooms, should not have 11 of them standing closed, like held breath. It is not good for the building." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are very practical," he said. "I was raised in a house that lost everything," she said. Practicality was the only thing that did not have to be sold. They stood in the winter garden, and the crow on the far wall lost interest in them and moved on, and the frost on the grass caught the pale light and held it briefly before letting it go. Inside the manor, Galt was reorganizing the household schedule with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the composition of a house had changed overnight and intended to serve the new composition as well as he had served the old. Lady Oran was somewhere in the formal sitting room, telling Tilda everything she had observed about the morning's events with tremendous authority and only moderate accuracy. Piers was at his desk in the secretary's office, writing a letter to his mother's remaining family in the northern counties, his handwriting steadier than it had been the day before. And in a room somewhere in the east wing, Barrow sat alone with a small leather booklet in his hands, and 30 years of silence finally broken open around him. And if he wept in the private way of men who have been strong for so long that softness, when it finally comes, arrives like something foreign and entirely necessary. Lettice and Castian walked back toward the house. At the steps, she paused and reached into her coat pocket. The vial was still there, had been there all morning, small and warm and patient. She looked at it in her palm for a moment. Then she set it carefully on the stone balustrade. She did not need it for Barrow. That battle had been fought with paper and honesty and a room full of people willing, finally, to tell the truth. She did not need it for anyone. Castian looked at the vial. He did not ask what it was. He looked at her face and understood enough. "It is over?" he asked. "This part," she said. "The Western Lord and the Assembly member are still out there." "Yes," he said. "We will need to be careful," she said. "And very patient." "Yes," he said again. She left the vial on the balustrade and went inside. He followed. Behind them, the winter garden sat still and cold and quiet, holding everything that had passed through it without comment, the way old ground holds everything. The crow did not return. The frost continued its slow retreat from the grass as the pale sun climbed without hurry toward the middle of the sky. Greyhollow Manor stood as it had always stood, but the air inside it, for the first time in 30 years, moved freely through all its rooms. The story had not ended, but the silence that had held it hostage was broken, and that, for now, was enough.